This next chapter of Facing West is called Indian Attack. If you are someone who is a Native American on the trail, then you can use this information in a certain way. And if you're someone who is for example, a pioneer on the trail who is taking the trail maybe with your family, you can use this information in a different way. And if you're a gold miner, maybe you can write about how you experienced this on your journey, or have a flashback or a dream of something like this. All different ways that you can use the information in this chapter to benefit your writing. Again, the title of the chapter is called Indian Attack. "Don't hit my arm again." Ben shook his pencil at Amanda. "You made me write June 6th, 1841 instead of 1845. He wanted to get everything down right, so he'd remember just the way it was. After 2 months, this was the first time they'd taken a day off. Now endlessly creaking wheels, no snapping whips, no walking. Ben leaned back against the wagon wheel and propped the journal against his knees. "We are in a river of buffalo," he wrote. They were walking past around the wagons. There must be 1,000 of them. He crossed 1,000 and wrote millions. Wow. The huge animals were just passing by, stopping to graze, then moving. They didn't seem to feel the harsh wind that had swept over the train for weeks now. Now remember, when they say train, they're not talking about a train like we're thinking, maybe like a subway or a Metro North. They're thinking of a wagon train. And again, that's lots of different covered wagons walking in a row. So anytime you hear train, don't think of the train like you would think of it in modern times. We're thinking of a wagon train. I'll try to post a picture of that with this chapter. The huge animals were just passing by, stopping to graze, then moving on. They didn't seem to feel the harsh wind that swept over the train for weeks now. They didn't seem to see the train either. "They're so noisy. Their hooves thud and their bellies rumble. They grind their teeth, too. I can hear buffalo belches and breaths and snores and yellow moos at each other all the time." Bellows and moos at each other, not yellows, excuse me. Ben knew it wasn't good writing. He didn't care. He wanted to save this and someday tell somebody what it was like. Maybe he'd copy it over and send it back to his uncle in Chicago. Maybe he'd mail it to the newspaper. "And they stink. Dirty wool, fresh wet buffalo chips and puddles, stomachs, gas. The ground is the only good smell. After all their hooves dig it up, it smells like new plowed field." Ben faced west. He heard the buffalo were still coming, walking in clumps and alone, cows and little calves, bulls and yearlings. Their hair is so long in the front that they can't see their eyes and the horns, and their back halves look like Pa shaved, each one and every one of them. Buffalo calves are as big as cows. The bulls look as big as elephants. Ben stopped trying to show the buffaloes in words. Instead, he drew a sketch in his journal. "Not bad," he said out loud, and then looked around quickly. Amanda didn't stop sewing. Mama was still down the river with Becky washing clothes. He started writing again. "Pa and the other men went out for the hunt this morning. Pa told them that buffalo were near." "Have you seen the guards?" Amanda stopped sewing. There were more than two men. There should be more than 2 men. She threw the shirt she'd been working on into the back of the wagon. She yanked another out of the mending bag. "What if they come for us while all the other men are gone?" Ben didn't have to ask who they were. They were the Indians. Amanda was terrified of them. Everybody had been, at the start. People had told horrible stories around the campfires, posted extra lookouts, and kept every gun loaded and ready. 2 months had gone by, no sign of Indians, so the fear had faded, all except Amanda's. The cow hands could help in an attack, Ben said. "They're too busy keeping the cows from joining the buffalo, Ben, or they'd gone over the hill to shoot a few for themselves." She was right, he thought. When Pete said shooting near the wagons might start a stampede, almost all the men had grabbed their guns and ridden off into the herd. Amanda sighed and looked at the hills again. Well, Ben said, at least I'm here. You, Amanda said, what are you good for? Oh. As soon as you start to do a lick of work, your breathing gets funny, or Mama tells you to stop, and then she tells me to do it instead. Ben stared at her. He and Amanda often fought, but this was different. You're worse than useless, she went on. You're spoiled. Mama gives you all the coffee you want when you're having a spell. You get teas and treats and nobody else gets. Her voice was shaking. You don't have to gather buffalo chips all day long, and you don't even have to walk in the dust like the rest of us. Amanda reached into the sewing bag. Ben ducked and covered his head in with his journal. His sister's aim was good when she got mad. It's not fair. It's not fair, she choked. Ben looked over the book. Amanda was sobbing, her face stuffed into a ripped petticoat. Ben didn't know what to say. He reached out to her. Go away, she pulled away. Just go away. Ben walked silently out toward the buffalo. Is she right? He asked himself. He stared at the Scots Bluff. It had been so exciting to see the big landmarks. At first, Chimney Rock, the Courthouse Rock, he'd sketched each one in his journal. Now the towering landmarks just looked cold and distant. Ben took his knife and picked up a broken spoke from the wagon wheel. The oak was dry and it was hard, for the blade could barely cut it. I want to stop right there for a second because the author included these really cool things like the Courthouse Rock and Chimney Rock. And before there was Google Maps, people needed different ways to mark how far they had gone on the Oregon Trail if they were a pioneer. And they used these landmarks as a way to mark how far along on the trail they were. And these are actual real landmarks. You can look them up on Google. Thankfully, we have it today. You can look up the Courthouse Rock and the Chimney Rock, and these are all really important landmarks that you could include in your journal. Getting a lot of messages here. Excuse me, I'm going to keep going. He threw the spoke away as hard as he could. It's not my fault, he whispered to the endless dry wind. I don't want asthma. I don't want to be spoiled. I don't want any of it. He picked up an old dry piece of buffalo droppings and threw it too. I'm not useless, Ben said aloud. He was just wishing he knew what it was good for. He threw another buffalo chip harder. He ought to be gathering them for tonight's fire, he thought, and any other boy would. He threw another. A fine shot. Ben turned to see Zach. His friend reached down for the chip and Ben grabbed one too. Instead of throwing it off toward the bluff, he hit Zach with it. What? Zach stood up in surprise and Ben slammed another one. Zach looked angry for a minute, then grinned. If it's war you want. Zach's throw hit Ben's head and a battle was on. The boys stopped to grab chips and ran, stopping only to fire them at each other. The oldest driest chips burst into flakes as they hit. Their dust swept away like smoke on the wind. Fresh chips hit harder. The battle was silent at first. Then it got loud. Gotcha, Zach would tell. Or, good shot. Then he laughed. Then the laughter started. Ben shot one at Zach's knee and crouched low, and Zach ran on. He turned and raised his arm to throw and froze. Oh no, he cried. A buffalo chip flew past Ben's hand and plopped on Zach's gut. Oof! Zach scooped another chip. Ben turned to see the attackers. An Indian? An Indian boy and Pete? A damp chip smacked into his cheek. He ducked to grab another chip, but he didn't make sense. But there was no time to figure it out. Pete and the boy were throwing chips at them, and their aim was deadly. One hit Ben's shoulder and nearly spun him around. No fair, he yelled. Pete, you're too strong, he answered with a soggy plop on his shoulder. Ben pulled up the dry chip and knocked Pete's hat off. Pete just laughed and kept fighting. The battle lasted until all four stood panting in the sunshine. Pete raised his hand. Nuff, bear cubs. he said. Then he said something to the native boy in a language Ben had never heard. Ben laughed and the boy... excuse me, that's not what it says. Ben thought the boy was about his age. How? He said and held up his hand. The boy laughed and said something to Pete, and the mountain man nodded. He says with what you've got on your hands, you better not greet too many people that way, Pete explained. Now remember, buffalo chips are essentially buffalo poop, and when they dry out, you can throw them and play a game, which is what they're doing here. Ben looked down at his hand and hooted. Maybe we'd better wash up, he said. He could imagine what his mother would say. And what Amanda would think about the Indian. He looked more closely at the boy. The boy was looking over at him, too. Sokka just wanted to see a white boy close up, Pete explained. I told him that I had several I was keeping prisoner. Me, powerful warrior, see? Zack knocked his hat off with another chip. Ben watched the Indian walk into the muddy water in the Platte River. Wait for me, he yelled. He pulled off his boots and socks, slipped his suspenders down, dropped his pants, unbuttoned his cuffs, and pulled his shirt over his head. You should dress like the Sioux, Pete called. Ben, Sioux is a Native American tribe, wished he could. The Indian was wearing a wide strip of soft leather pulled up between his legs. It was tied with a string on his waist. That was it. Plus moccasins, just like Pete's. Ben pushed up his sleeves with his long johns and waded into the river. Sokka kicked water into his face, and the battle went on until Pete had the boy in the back of the Sioux hunting camp. Had to take the boy back to the Sioux hunting camp. It's just beyond the bluff, he explained, and climbed onto the horses. I lived with the tribe for years, back before there were Wiggler. He looked at Ben's face. Don't worry, Bear Cub. I'll be back to set off the wagon tomorrow. The boys let the hot wind dry out their long johns while they walked back to the train. First time I've felt cool in a month. Ben said when they stopped to dress. Zack looked up at the sun and shook his head. I'd better get some chips for the supper fire. For the supper fire. Supper is another way to refer to dinner, and I think that's another great way that the author put in a time period clue into this book, because we don't often refer today, at least I don't, to my dinner as supper. But that was a pretty common phrase back in the 1800s. Ben didn't have to do that. It was Amanda's chore. Like most everything else, he thought. He stood for a moment and looking at the Scots Bluff. Then he reached down and started to gather chips. Until next time. And the next chapter is called Divide. So, that's it. Have a good day.